My parents have betrayed me. They wanted to take my club to court and then they ruined my business for $5,000. So I've sued them. Hey, read it. I've spent the last few hours staring at this screen, wondering if I should post this. You know that weird moment when you want to share something but feel like you're opening up a part of your soul to strangers? Well, here goes nothing. Here's my story. A story of pain and survival, betrayal, and somehow, through everything, finding a way out. I'm hoping that someone out there can understand. And perhaps I can begin to piece together the shattered parts of myself. I am not sure if you have ever felt like you didn't belong in your own home, but that was my reality growing up. My parents, Richard and Teresa, were the type of people who should never have had children, but they did. Unfortunately, I was left to bear the brunt of the consequences. I remember feeling unwanted since I was able to form memories, as if I was a mistake. My father, Richard, was cold and distant, but there was more to it. He was a tyrant. No, scratch that. He was a monster dressed in a suit, someone who used intimidation and fear to dominate every aspect of my life. My mother, Teresa, was not much better. She had a talent for manipulation, this ability to blame myself for everything. She was the queen of guilt-tripping. She used her sweet voice to convince the outside world that she was the ideal mother, while making my life an absolute hell. It was as if I had two versions of my parents, the ones the world saw and the real versions. On the surface, these were the people I spent my entire life with. We were a typical middle-class family, living in a decent neighborhood, working decent jobs, and doing what other families do. But that was only a mask. It was like a war zone behind closed doors. Nothing I tried was ever good enough. Not my grades. This is not my behavior, not even my own existence. When I was about 9 years old, I got a B+ on a math test. I was quite proud of it, given how diligently I had studied for it. However, when my father saw the grade, he did not even look at me. He simply shook his head and muttered something about how I would be a failure if I didn't get my act together. That was my dad. No words of encouragement. There is no recognition of effort, just a disappointment. My mother was worse. She'd tell me things like, "Your father works so hard for this family and you can't even do well in school. You're exactly like your father's brother." And you know how it turned out. Her favorite comparison was to my uncle, who had been disowned by the family due to his alcoholism and gambling. That was her way of telling me that I was worthless, just like him. But there was physical abuse. That was another story entirely. My father had a habit of turning minor infractions into punishable offenses. I could be standing in his way. Maybe I didn't respond quickly enough when he asked me a question, and he exploded. His temper was frightening. He'd throw things, punch holes in the walls, and, on more than one occasion, lash out at me. I would come to school with bruises on my arms, my back, or my legs, and the teachers simply looked away. They seemed to be aware but unwilling to participate. This is a classic case of not my problem. School was the only place I was able to breathe. Despite how miserable I was at home, I was not in immediate danger when I entered the school building. Sure, I experienced anxiety and was constantly on edge, but it wasn't the same. It was not like walking on eggshells around my father. Despite the trauma I carried with me every day, I was able to find a group of friends who made life more bearable. We weren't the most popular kids at school, but we didn't mind. We had each other, and that's all that matters. Jake was my closest friend. He was the loud and sarcastic type. Even when things seemed to be falling apart, he could always make me laugh. He had his own issues at home, but he never let them show. Then there was Max, the silent one. He did not say much, but when he did, you listened. He had a unique ability to observe everything and understand people in ways that most others could not. And then there was Emma. Emma was like the glue that held everyone together. She was intelligent, compassionate, and always optimistic. Even when the rest of us were in turmoil, the four of us became inseparable. We spent nearly every day together, either at school or at Jake's house, which provided a safe haven for all of us. His parents were completely opposite of mine, kind, understanding, and most importantly, they allowed us to be ourselves without judgment. In some ways, I believe this is why I was drawn to Jake's family. They showed me what a real family should look like, a family that loved and supported one another, not one that ripped each other apart. Things at home worsened over time. By the time I reached high school, the emotional and physical abuse had escalated. My father would come home from work, find something to complain about, and then vent his frustrations on me. It didn't matter whether I was doing homework or simply trying to stay out of his way. If he was feeling bad, I was the one who paid the price. My mother, ever the enabler, would stand back and watch. Sometimes she'd even encourage him, saying things like, "Maybe this will teach you to be a better son." It was sickening. I tried to concentrate on school, my friends, and anything else that could take my mind off the hell that was my life at home. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was trapped in an endless cycle of misery. I started withdrawing from everything. My grades slipped, my friendship began to strain, and I became a shell of the person I once was. I could feel myself sinking, but I wasn't sure how to ask for help. That's when I decided to drop out. It was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It had been building for months, possibly years. I couldn't take the pressure anymore. The constant abuse from my parents, the anxiety of trying to keep up in school, and the overwhelming sense that I would never be good enough. It was just too much. So one day I walked into school, went to the principal's office, and informed them that I was done. I was dropping out. I think they were surprised at first, but they didn't fight me about it. They could see how drained I was, how much I had already given up. They considered me a lost cause. The hardest part for me was telling my friends. I remember the look on my face when I told her she looked like she was about to cry, but she remained composed. Max just nodded in his usual quiet manner. Jake joked about how he always knew I'd be the first to drop out, but I could tell he was concerned. My parents, of course, lost their minds. My father raged for hours, calling me every name in the book and saying I was a disgrace to the family. My mother fared no better. She cried and played the victim, telling anyone who would listen that I was ungrateful and was wasting my life. But I didn't care. I couldn't care anymore. I had reached a breaking point. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life after that. I had no plan or direction. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house anymore. The abuse and constant belittling, it was destroying me. I needed a way out, and fast. That's when I decided to apply to universities. It seemed like a long shot, especially given that I had dropped out of high school, but I decided it was worth a shot. To my surprise, I got in. Not to an Ivy League school, but to a reputable university. It was my ticket out, my chance to leave the hell that was my life. I packed my bags and left as soon as possible. My parents did not attempt to stop me. In fact, I believe they were relieved to get rid of me. They didn't want me around any more than I wanted to be there. University felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in my life, I was free. Free from constant scrutiny and abuse, I can be myself. It wasn't easy, however. The physical and emotional scars left by my parents did not simply vanish because I moved. I carried the trauma with me wherever I went, but at least I was away from them. I made new friends at university, but I never let go of those I already had. Jake, Max, and Emma remained by my side, even though we weren't physically together as often. We stayed in touch, and whenever I came home for breaks, we would get together, talk about life, and plan for the future. We had a running joke that one day we'd all pack up and move to some random city where no one knew us, where we could start over and leave all of the nonsense behind. It was a dream, something we discussed when things got tough, but none of us expected it until it happened. At the end of my third year of university, things began to spiral out of control once more. My father showed up at my university one day, for reasons I still don't fully understand. He was angry, as he usually was, but this time was different. He didn't simply want to yell at me. He wanted to bring me home. He created a huge scene in front of everyone, demanding that I pack my belongings and leave with him. He called me a failure, a disappointment, and declared that if I did not return home, I was dead to him. That was the final straw. I was not going back. I could not go back. I called Jake that night and we spoke for hours. He knew I was at my breaking point. And for the first time, we weren't joking about fleeing. We were serious. The following day, I called Max and Emma, and within a week, we had a plan. We had no idea where we were going, but we knew we needed to leave. We pooled our money, packed our belongings, and bid farewell to the only place we'd ever known. We left in the middle of the night and drove for hours until we arrived in a city neither of us had ever visited before. It was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. We didn't have anywhere to stay. We had no jobs and no idea what the future held. But we were together, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my life. The first few weeks were tough. We found a cheap, run-down apartment that we could barely afford, and we survived on ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. We didn't care. We were free. We spent our days exploring the city, looking for work, and attempting to figure out what the hell we were doing. It was disorganized, but it was ours. Of course, my parents took my disappearance seriously. They called me frequently, left voicemail messages, and sent emails, anything to draw me back into their web. But I ignored them. I knew that if I gave in and went back, it would be the end of me. So I cut them off completely, changed my phone number, blocked them on all platforms, and made sure they couldn't contact me. That is where I am now, sitting in a small apartment with my friends, trying to figure out what the next step is. We're not wealthy, we are not successful, and we certainly don't have everything figured out. But we're trying. We are doing it on our own terms, and that is more than I ever imagined was possible. Hello, Reddit. It's me again. It's been a while since I told you about my story. If you've been following along, you know that my friends and I escaped a life of abuse and hardship, packed everything up and relocated to a new city to start over. Back then, I was just a scared kid with a bag of clothes. I had some friends by my side, but I was also very uncertain about the future. A lot has changed since then, and not everything went as planned. So here's what happened after we took the big leap. After we moved to the new city, we lived pretty much day to day. The small apartment we found was barely livable, with cracked walls, no furniture, and a constant odor of mildew. We didn't care, however. It was freedom. At least we were free of our old lives, our parents, and everything that had made us feel suffocated. However, living solely on ramen and cheap beer was unsustainable, and soon, the excitement of starting over was eclipsed by the harsh reality that we were broke. And life was not going to just give us a miracle. That is when we met Leo. Leo exuded charisma. He was only a few years older than us, possibly in his mid-20s, but he carried himself as if he had seen and done everything. He was the type of guy who could always tell the best stories at parties. The guy who knew a guy who could get you anything you wanted, no questions asked. We didn't immediately trust him. How could we? He was way too smooth and self-confident. But when you are desperate, trust comes more easily than it should. Leo made his money in ways that weren't exactly legal, but weren't entirely illegal either. He lived in a gray zone where hustlers thrive. We met him through one of Jake's old acquaintances from high school. Jake was always the type to know people, and in this case, his connections paid off. Sort of. One night, we were sitting around in our dingy apartment wondering how we were going to make rent for the next month, when Jake said, "Hey, I know this guy who might be able to help us out. He's a bit unconventional, but he's made a lot of money and he's looking for partners." I wasn't keen on the idea at first. I mean, the last thing I wanted was to get involved in something shady. But at the same time, what were our options? We were broke, barely getting by, and the jobs we had lined up weren't paying enough to cover our bills. Max was working part-time as a tech support guy. Emma was still waiting tables, and Jake and I were picking up odd jobs wherever we could. None of us were making more than a few $100 a month, and it wasn't enough. So we decided to meet Leo the first time we met him. I knew this guy was different. He was dressed sharp, had this air of confidence that made you instantly feel like you were dealing with someone who had it all figured out. Leo was the kind of guy who could sell sand in the desert. He just had that way about him. He sat us down at this trendy coffee shop in town, bought us all drinks, and started talking. "So you guys want to make some money, right?" he said, smiling like he already knew the answer. "I've got a way for you to do it fast. Simple. No strings attached." At this point, we were all ears. Leo started explaining his plan, something he called the Bureau. The idea was simple. We buy shares of small, struggling companies that no one had ever heard of, and then sell those shares to people looking to invest at rock-bottom prices. The trick was that the companies we were dealing with were barely hanging on. Most of them were on the verge of bankruptcy, but we would spin it like they were undervalued and poised for a turnaround. In short, it was a hustle. And while it wasn't outright illegal, it was certainly unethical. At first we hesitated. I mean, we weren't exactly saints, but none of us wanted to end up behind bars for some quick cash. But Leo was convincing. He laid it all out. How easy it was, how we wouldn't get caught, how we'd make more money in a few months than we ever would working minimum wage jobs. He even threw in some numbers showing us how we'd done this before and made a killing. "I'm not saying you'll be millionaires," Leo said with a grin, "but you'll be a hell of a lot better off than you are right now." Jake was the first to jump on board. No surprise there. He'd always been the one willing to take risks, and he had a natural talent for convincing people to follow his lead. Max, being the tech guy, saw the potential for us to automate most of the process, which would make things easier and less risky. Emma wasn't thrilled with the idea. She was the one who always tried to keep us grounded, to remind us of the consequences. But even she knew we were running out of options. And me? I knew it was a bad idea from the start, but I couldn't deny the temptation. The thought of finally getting ahead, of not worrying about rent or bills, was too powerful to ignore. So we did it. We became the bureau. The first few weeks were slow. We were still getting the hang of things, learning how to pitch the stocks, figuring out who to target, and trying to get people to trust us enough to invest. Leo taught us how to talk to potential buyers, how to make them believe in the potential of these failing companies. Jake, with his natural charisma, became our main salesman. He could talk anyone into anything, and it wasn't long before he was closing deals left and right. Max set up our website, creating a sleek, professional front that made us look like a legitimate investment firm. He even rigged it so that everything looked legal. Fake documents, fake company profiles, the whole 9 yards. It was scary how good he was at it. Emma handled the books, keeping track of the money coming in and making sure everything was organized. She didn't like what we were doing, but she kept her mouth shut. And me? I was somewhere in the middle, helping out wherever I could. Try not to think too hard about the fact that we were basically conning people out of their money. Surprisingly, it worked. People started buying not a lot at first, but enough to keep us afloat. Then, as word spread, more and more people came to us looking to get in on these undervalued stocks. It was insane how fast things escalated. Within a few months, we were pulling in thousands of dollars in profit. Way more than we had ever expected. It felt like we were on top of the world. We had money. We had freedom. And for the first time in a long time, we didn't feel like we were just surviving. We were thriving. We even upgraded our apartment, moving into a nicer place with actual furniture and a kitchen that didn't look like it was about to fall apart. But success brought paranoia. The bigger we got, the more we worried about being caught. We all knew we were on a fine line. Every time the phone rang, my heart skipped a beat because I assumed it was the police or some irate investor coming to shut us down. We had gotten too deep and were now stuck. Leo, of course, did not appear to care. He kept telling us we were untouchable, that no one would notice as long as we kept it cool. Then we met Mike. Mike was one of our most serious buyers. He was not like the other people we dealt with. Most of our clients knew little about investing. They simply wanted to make a quick buck. But Mike knew his stuff. He began asking questions. We were unable to answer certain questions. He wanted financial reports, balance sheets, and proof that the companies we were selling stock in were legitimate. We initially tried to dismiss him, but Mike wouldn't have it. He kept digging and pushing until he threatened to report us. That quote S when we realized we needed to shut it down. We couldn't take the risk anymore. With one wrong move, everything we had built would crumble. So we paused. The bureau was done. It wasn't an easy decision, but we were all confident it was the right one. We had made a good income, more than enough to start over, and it wasn't worth the risk of being caught. We shut down the website, deleted all of our records, and disappeared for a while. It felt like we were walking on eggshells, waiting for the next shoe to drop, but nothing happened. Mike never followed through on his threat. and nobody came after us. We were free, but we had a new issue. What were we going to do with all of the money we had made? That's when Jake had the idea to start a gaming club. It wasn't as crazy as it seemed. We'd all grown up playing video games, and with the rise of esports and gaming culture, establishing a gaming club seemed like the ideal way to turn our illegal gains into something legal. Furthermore, it would provide us with the opportunity to create something we were truly passionate about. We pooled our money and discovered this old building in the city. It was a disaster, but it had potential. Over the next few months, we worked day and night to transform the place into the ultimate gaming hangout. We bought high-end gaming PCs, consoles, and even some classic arcade machines. The walls were adorned with neon lights and posters from all our favorite games. When we were younger, we would have given anything to be able to hang out there. We called it the Nexus, and it quickly became a hit. Initially, there were only a few regulars, college students, and locals looking for a place to hang out and play games. However, as word spread, an increasing number of people showed up. We hosted tournaments, streamed sporting events, and even formed our own small team. The Nexus became the city's go-to gaming destination, and we were finally making money in the right way. Things were going great until, as usual, life threw us a curveball. One night, as we were closing the club, a man walked in. He was in his 40s and wore a suit that looked out of place in our little gaming haven. He introduced himself as Detective Harris, and I immediately felt my stomach drop. I was convinced this was it. The bureau had caught up with us, but Harris pulled out a photo of Leo. "Have you seen this man?" he asked. Leo had vanished months ago without a word. He was there one day to help us set up the Nexus. In the next moment, he was gone. His phone was disconnected, and his apartment was empty. We didn't know where he went or why he left. Detective Harris explained that Leo was involved in something far greater than we realized, something that piqued the interest of law enforcement. I told the detective the truth. We had not seen or heard from Leo since he vanished. Harris didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push the issue. He handed us his card and instructed us to call if we heard anything. After he left, we sat silently, trying to process what had just happened. Leo had always been a little shady, but we had no idea he was involved in something serious enough to draw the cops in. That night, we made an agreement. No more shady transactions. There are no more risks. We were going to keep the Nexus clean and legitimate no matter what. Since then, things have gone well. We've expanded the Nexus, opened a second location, and are even considering branching out into new areas. Consider opening a cafe or a tech repair shop. We're creating something real, something we are proud of. And for the first time in a long time, we feel like we're on the right track. But I still think about Leo. Where is he now? Is he running? Did he get caught? Is he out there somewhere, living a new life just as we are? I suppose we'll never know. For the time being, all we can think about is the future, on creating something that lasts. We've come a long way since the days of the Bureau. And while I don't regret what we did to get here, I realize we were fortunate to escape when we did. Hello, Reddit. It's been a while since I last updated you, and things have become more intense. If you followed my story so far, you'll know that I left a toxic lifestyle, relocated to a new city with my friends, and founded the Nexus, a successful gaming club. Life was good. For the first time in years, I felt very good. But just when I thought I'd left my past behind, it resurfaced unexpectedly. This is the story of how my parents tried to bring me down and almost ruined everything I worked for. Spoiler, they failed. It had been nearly 4 years since I had seen my parents, Richard and Teresa. And truthfully, I had hoped I would never see them again. After everything they put me through as a child, including constant abuse, manipulation, and outright hatred, I assumed they were gone for good. But the thing about toxic people is that they always find a way back into your life, especially if they notice you're doing better without them. A few months ago, I began receiving strange phone calls, blocked numbers, long periods of silence, and then a hang-up. It was annoying, but I didn't give it much thought at the time. I attributed it to prank callers, or possibly telemarketers who were too lazy to leave a message. It wasn't until the letters began to arrive that I sensed something darker was brewing. The first one was a simple side note. You can't avoid your past forever. Cryptic, sure, but I ignored it. I had a business to run, and I was not going to let some creepy anonymous message ruin my good fortune. However, the letters became more personal, mentioning my parents, the abuse, and even referring to my friends Jake, Max, and Emma. That's when I began to worry that whoever was behind this new way knew too much about me. The day my parents arrived at the Nexus was one I'll never forget. Jake had been manning the front desk while I was in the office reviewing some financials. I heard the door chime but didn't give it much thought. Everyone came and went all day. But then Jake burst into the office, pale as a sheet. "They've arrived," he announced, barely above a whisper. I frowned, not understanding what he was talking about. Who is here? He did not have to respond. When I walked out to the front, I noticed Richard and Teresa standing in the center of my club, looking as out of place as you could imagine. It was like seeing ghosts. My heart dropped, and for a brief moment, I felt like that terrified child again, waiting for the next verbal or physical blow. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I took a deep breath and walked up to them. They appeared older, of course. Richard's hair had turned gray, and Teresa's face had become more wrinkled, but their expressions remained unchanged. My father's eyes remained hard and cold, and my mother's face had been twisted into her usual mask of forced pleasantry. "What are you doing here?" I inquired, not bothering to hide my anger. My father smirked with a condescending tilt of his head. "Well, we heard about your success," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "It appears that our little failure has accomplished something worthwhile." I held back the urge to yell. "What do you want?" Teresa stepped forward. Her voice was dripping with fake sweetness. "We reasoned that because we are your parents and have done so much for you, it was only fair that we get involved in your business. A partnership of sorts." I couldn't believe what they were saying after everything they'd done to me. Everything I had survived. They had the audacity to come here and claim I owed them something. I laughed, but not out of amusement. It was disbelief. "You have got to be kidding me." Richard's face hardened. "We are not joking. You've created something impressive, but you could benefit from the advice of more experienced individuals. We can help you grow, make this thing larger than you ever imagined." I shook my head and clenched my fists at my sides. "No, absolutely not. You cannot walk in here and act as if you are entitled to anything. You were not there for me. You've done nothing but bring me down my entire life. And now you think I'm going to let you walk into my business? Get out!" Teresa's smile wavered. "We are your parents. Blood is thicker than water. Don't make this any harder than it needs to be." My stomach churned at the sound of her voice, the way she twisted everything to make it seem like she was the victim. But I wasn't really scared. I am no longer a broken kid. I had built this business with my own hands and my friends, and I was not going to let them ruin it. I moved closer, glaring at them. "You made it clear long ago that you don't care about me. You only care about yourselves. Now leave or I will have you thrown out." They did not argue. Richard's eyes narrowed, and I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface, but they turned and walked away without saying anything. I assumed that was the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I received a letter through the mail. It was from an attorney. My parents were accompanying me to court. They claimed they were entitled to a share of the Nexus because they had financially supported me and believed I owed them compensation for the years they had spent raising me. I was infuriated. The thought of my parents, who had only abused and manipulated me, attempting to take away the one thing I had created for myself was infuriating. They had not supported me. They had been the reason I left in the first place, and now they were attempting to worm their way back into my life for money. I hired a lawyer, a tough-as-nails woman named Jessica, whom Emma had recommended. Jessica didn't take shit from anyone, and when I told her about the situation, she was all in. "We're going to fight this," she declared, her voice filled with determination. "They have no leg to stand on, but we must be prepared. People like your parents do not give up easily." The following few weeks were a nightmare. My parents' lawyer, a smug, overconfident man named Robert, was relentless. They requested a wide range of financial records, business documents, and personal information in the hopes of finding something to use against me. They were clearly attempting to overwhelm us, making us feel as if we were drowning in legal paperwork. But Jessica was a fighter. She dismantled their arguments piece by piece, pointing out that I had been financially independent for years, that my parents had never contributed to my business, and that their claims were completely false. Nonetheless, the stress of the situation was taking its toll. My friends were concerned, particularly Emma. She kept telling me to take breaks and get away from the chaos for a while, but how could I? This was my livelihood on the line, and the prospect of my parents winning made my blood boil. The court date has finally arrived, and walking into that courtroom was one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. I'd never been in a legal battle before, and seeing my parents sit there so calm and composed made my stomach turn. But I was not about to back down. Not this time. The trial was brutal. My parents' lawyer portrayed them as victims, loving parents who had made tremendous sacrifices for their ungrateful child. They told me all about how they had supported me emotionally and financially, how they had always believed in me, and how I was now successful. I was selfishly excluding them from my life. I could not sit still as they lied through their teeth. But when it was my turn to testify, I did not hold back. I told the court about the years of abuse, the manipulation, and the emotional and physical scars they had left on me. It wasn't easy for me to reveal everything. Reliving those memories in front of strangers, including my parents, was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. But I needed the truth to come out. I needed them to know who my parents truly were. When the trial ended, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders. I had done all I could. Now all I had to do was wait. 1 week later, the verdict has arrived. The judge ruled in my favor. My parents had no claim to my business or any of the money I'd earned, and they were ordered to pay all legal fees. It was a victory, but it didn't seem like one. I didn't want to go to court in the first place. I simply wanted them out of my life. However, they couldn't leave well enough alone. The day after the court decision, I walked into the Nexus and felt as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath me. The front windows had shattered. The neon signs we'd installed were broken. And inside, things were even worse. The gaming stations had been smashed, monitors were destroyed, arcade machines were overturned. The place was a wreck. It was as if someone had destroyed everything we had worked so hard to create. My heart sank as I stood there, staring at the devastation. Jake and Max were with me, and I could see the disbelief on their faces. "Who in hell would do this?" Max muttered, running his hand through his hair while surveying the damage. But I knew I didn't have evidence, and I knew my parents had lost in court, and this was their way of retaliating. They couldn't beat me legally, so they planned to destroy me in another way. Naturally, we contacted the cops. They came, took photos, and filed a report. But I could tell they were not optimistic about apprehending whoever did it. Vandalism cases like this are rarely resolved, especially when there is no clear trail to follow. But I wasn't going to let it go. I needed answers fast. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. Enter Detective Markson. He wasn't the typical detective you see in movies. There's no trench coat, fedora, or gruff attitude. He was just a regular guy in his late 40s, dressed in a well-tailored suit and with a calm, measured demeanor. He had a reputation for getting results, which was exactly what I needed. I told him all about my parents, the court case involving vandalism. He listened intently, taking notes, but said little at first. When I finished, he nodded. "I'll look into it," he replied. "I can't promise anything, but I'll look around to see what I can find. People such as your parents are prone to making mistakes." Markson began his investigation immediately. He obtained surveillance footage from nearby businesses, interviewed locals, and followed up on any leads he could find. It didn't take him long to start putting things together. The breakthrough came when Markson discovered security footage from a gas station down the street from the Nexus late at night, just hours before the vandalism took place. Richard's car was seen pulling into the station. He got out, filled the tank, and drove away in the direction of the Nexus. It wasn't definitive proof, but it confirmed my suspicions. Markson kept digging until he found the smoking gun. A witness who lived in the apartment building across from the Nexus reported seeing two people outside the club late that night. They couldn't identify them, but they remembered one of them saying something like, "He'll regret this." It wasn't much, but it was enough to implicate my parents in the crime. I had the evidence I needed with Mark's assistance. We've gathered everything. I reviewed the surveillance footage, witness testimony, and timing, and decided to take my parents to court again. This time I wasn't defending myself. This time, I went on the offensive. I wasn't sure I could handle another court case so soon after the first, but there I was, sitting in the same courtroom as my parents, staring across the aisle. They appeared more nervous this time, however. They knew the evidence was stacked against them, and no amount of manipulation or deception would save them now. Their lawyer attempted to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial, but Mark's investigation was conclusive. The footage, the witness, and the fact that they had a clear motive all indicated that my parents had orchestrated the vandalism. They were desperate to destroy me, and they had turned to criminal behavior to do so. The trial lasted a week, and by the end, the verdict was clear. The judge ruled in my favor again. My parents were found guilty of vandalizing the Nexus and ordered to pay damages equal to the cost of repairs, plus more. It wasn't a large sum, but it was sufficient to convey a message. They couldn't mess with me anymore. It's been a month since the second court ruling, and things are finally starting to calm down. The Nexus is back up and running, better than ever. We used the compensation money to not only repair the damage, but also to upgrade our equipment, and our business has been thriving since. I haven't heard from my parents since the trial, and I honestly hope I never will again. They've been officially removed from my life, both legally and emotionally, and I finally accepted that they will never change. My friends Jake, Max, and Emma have been my rock throughout this. Without them, I don't think I would have made it through the last few months. We've created something incredible together, and no one, including my parents, can take it away from us. So that is where I am currently. Reddit. From a terrified child who fled from his abusive parents to a successful business owner who fought back and won. It's been a crazy journey, and I'm not sure what the future holds. But for the first time in my life, I am not afraid of it.